Well, thanks for doing this. It's a pleasure to finally meet you.
My pleasure.
Watched you for years on TV and always enjoyed your work. Let's start. Tell us about your roots. You're a native Illinois.
Born and raised in Rockford, Illinois. I was born on July 9th, 1936. My mother always told me that it was 109 in the shade that day. And so when I went back to the hospital where I was born to speak a few years ago, I got a copy of the New York Times for that day. And indeed, the entire front page was about the heat wave in the Midwest. So she was right. It was a very hot day.
Who were your influences when you were growing up? Who were the people you looked up to?
Well, we were very much involved, our entire family, in church, First Covenant Church as it was and is. And so people in that church had a great influence on me. But if I were to pick one person who clearly, in retrospect, had an enormous influence on what I ultimately did, it would be my debate coach in high school, a man named John Berlin. We called him Gov because he had a deep, intense interest in politics. And he was my debate coach for my 3 years in high school, East Senior High School. We won the state championship. And he was the one who really helped me to learn to think on my feet and to respond quickly to what was going on around me. And those skills came in very handy in my ultimate life work.
You were, I assume, educated in Rockford and then came to Augustana?
I first went for 2 years to our then junior college, our church-related school in Chicago, North Park, now a four-year school. So we had to transfer after 2 years. I came here to Augustana for my last 2 years. Had a wonderful experience here at Augustana in every possible way.
You were drawn to the ministry. You didn't originally start out into the medical field. Tell me about that.
That's right. I came to college pretty sure that I was going to become a minister. It was a tradition in our family, and I was raised, as I said, in the church. So I majored in history, minored in philosophy, graduated from Augustana in 1958, went off to seminary, completed seminary, but while in seminary, started getting interested in medicine as a field. To put it in very simplistic terms, I became aware of the fact that doctors and nurses and other people in the hospital setting really could help people very quickly, and the work in the ministry was kind of long-term, to be clear, obviously. And somehow that appealed to me. To make a long story short, I went back, took the science courses needed to apply, applied, and started medical school 2 years after I graduated from seminary.
What was your specialty?
I trained in internal medicine, but I actually practiced emergency medicine before it became its own specialty in the 1980s. So I practiced in emergency room in Lynn, Massachusetts, and then at the Mass General Hospital in Boston.
And that, of course, is, you talk about thinking on your feet. You're presented with good everything coming through that door.
One of the things that appealed to me about that as a specialty is that it was always different. You never knew what was coming through the door, literally. And I found that very appealing. Some people wouldn't like that, but for me it was the right choice.
And you went on to earn a degree from Harvard, a master's in public health?
I did. Once I got started in television work, which was a total accident, I realized if I was going to continue in that work, I needed a little more training in epidemiology and biostatistics, more than you get in medical school. So I had an office at Harvard Medical School, and right next door was the Harvard School of Public Health, and so over a 2-year period, part-time, I got a master's in public health.
Now, I had read that you had actually done some TV in New York, is that right?
That's correct. Again, just one of these impulsive things, I got involved with a station, I'm forgetting the call letters, but I believe it was the very first station, television station in the country, owned by General Electric, WRGB. And I had a chance conversation with the news director, and so while I was working in the hospital, I would go in once a week and pop into the evening news and talk about what was in the news medically. And so I did that until we moved to the Boston area.
And you really hit your stride, though, when you came to Boston and worked at WCVB TV, is that right?
That's correct. This was a station that was started in 1972. The original license for that station, Channel 5, had been taken away from the Herald Traveler Corporation because there was some cloud of impropriety about the way it had been awarded originally. So they threw it open and awarded it again as if for the first time. And the group that won the license in a long, protracted battle with other applicants was a group called Boston Broadcasters Incorporated, mostly Harvard people. One of the people was Dr. John Knowles, who was the general director of the Mass General Hospital. We had known each other. He'd heard me give a few lectures. He thought I might be good at hosting a program for the public, and so he recommended me, and I said, okay, we'll try it for a few months. That's how I got started.
Now, in terms of today's production values, it was probably kind of primitive for them.
It was primitive, and intriguingly, given that we're sitting here in the John Deere World Headquarters, the building that they started the station in was a John Deere warehouse that bought, gutted, and converted into a television station. And so they were learning as they went, and I was on the second day of the new station's on-air programming, and they basically said, okay, there's the chair, there's the camera, you go and just talk to the camera and lead the discussion, and that was it. I mean, very primitive training, no training really. They obviously had heard that I could use my mouth in reasonably coherent fashion, but it was no training, and they were hanging lights and putting things together even as we were doing the program live on the air, so it was primitive. But a great station because it was locally owned, and so they tried all kinds of different programming. They didn't have to report to the network or to a big corporation, and so they really were very innovative.
From a doctor's position, what were your goals for that kind of programming to get the information over to a lay audience? And it's a challenging thing.
It can be, and it should be. That first program that we did was called House Call, and it was a half-hour program, and I would have a physician colleague as a guest. We would pick a topic. We would open the first 10 minutes and discuss the topic in general, and then, believe it or not, we would open it up for live phone calls from the viewing audience with no delay. And we would get questions from people who had heard us and were watching, and they were excellent questions which led to informative answers. So it was really a teaching program. By the end of that half hour, we hoped that the viewing audience knew quite a bit more about that given topic than they did when we started.
Tell me about the move to network television, ABC. How did that happen?
That happened because the general manager of our television station in Boston, a man named Bob Bennett, was a visionary in so many different ways. And when ABC, we were an ABC affiliate, announced they were going to start a new morning program called Good Morning America, he, unbeknownst to me, called them up and said, you know, we have this young doctor that you ought to have on the program. And sure enough, they called up and asked if I would be interested, and I went down, and there must have been some auditions. I can't quite even remember the details, but I ended up on the program when it started in November of 1975 with David Hartman as the host. And I ended up being on that program for 45 years.
45.
40 years. 45 years. That's right, 45 years.
What are some of the highlights that come to mind?
Well, and of course, after a few years, what happened is then I joined ABC News full-time in 1984, 9 years after starting with Good Morning America, at which point I stopped practicing and worked full-time. And so I was involved with all the programs. And, oh, there's so many highlights, both in terms of the people that I was privileged to meet and interview and get to know, and the information that I was exposed to in that position. I could talk all day about it. But I'll tell you about, well, one that just literally pops into my mind was the very first time I was on World News with Peter Jennings after joining ABC News full-time in 1984. I was in New York working on my first 2020 report. Happened to be Monday, the day after the first debate between then President Reagan running for re-election versus Walter Mondale, challenger. And you may not remember, but in that first debate, Mr. Reagan had a very difficult time performing for some reason. Never found out why, really. So much so that the next day, all of the newspapers and programs were speculating about whether or not he was too old to run again for president. And so, predictably, all the evening news programs led with that as their first story. And here I am, new on the job as ABC News medical editor. First time they'd ever had a person like that. So they called me up late in the afternoon and said, we're going to leave with a story, and we want you to come on, and Peter's going to question you about whether or not Reagan is too old to run from a medical viewpoint. And I said, well, that doesn't sound like something. Oh, that's what you're hired. So here I find myself on the air with an anchor I had just met for the first time, talking about the President of the United States. I saved that tape, one of the few tapes I've saved. I look like a deer in the headlights, as I should have, but I managed somehow to say some things that were fairly coherent without sounding too political or controversial. So I do remember that very first episode.
And you would have, of course, you would have covered the AIDS epidemic from start to present.
Absolutely, and I can tell you an interesting story about that in brief form. So it just so happened that one morning, the very conservative columnist for the Boston Globe, a man named David Wilson, he was their token conservative, decided to view all 3 morning television programs and then write about them for his column. And it just so happened that morning I was on talking about the very first report about, not AIDS, it wasn't even called that then, a report about some unusual cluster of cases in the gay community in California. So I reported about this because it was so unusual and saying this is something we probably ought to keep our eye on and that gay men especially ought to be aware of. Well, he wrote the column and when it came to Good Morning America, he said, but even our own Dr. Timothy Johnson, meaning from Boston, was on the air talking about homosexuals in a very negative way, he wrote. So I wrote him a little private letter and I said, Mr. Wilson, you're entitled to your opinion about programming, of course, but I think you'll find out that this very early medical phenomenon may turn out to be quite significant. Well, of course it did. And to his great credit, he wrote a column every year about my worst mistakes, and number 1 on the list was that column he'd written about me for talking about this funny stuff, which in turn ultimately was the AIDS epidemic.
One of the things that strikes me,
Jack.
yeah,
Battery.
okay. With PBS affiliate,
Okay.
PBS member station.
Okay.
And when you get there tonight, you're going to see students on all the cameras and everything.
Okay.
We're one of those, we're kind of an odd place for a PBS station. Not many people or not many stations actually let the students touch beer. They can come in as freshmen and start using it.
Okay.
Well, Chris Beery is one of our people.
Okay. Yes,
Okay.
I knew that,
Yeah.
actually, now that you mention it.
Chris Beery, Walter Rogers, Jim Bitterman, a number of folks.
Yeah,
that come through
yeah.
there.
Interesting.
Speed.
Okay, great. One of the things that I always really liked about your work was how you could take this highly complicated and easily misunderstood information and make it understandable to the average person. Tell me about how you did that, because I think that was just key to it.
You know, I wish I could give you a clear answer to that, but the truth is it was mostly instinct. Now, all of the training I had had in terms of high school debate and training in seminary in terms of speaking certainly helped, but I always felt like I was talking to my brother or my mother or a friend when I was on the air, so that sort of subconsciously and instinctively I kept it at that level. And it was just, I guess, a gift that I had because I never had any training for it and I never really was told how to do it. It was just something that fortunately came naturally to me.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because what I tell a lot of my students is, look, assume that you're talking to your aunt, who is a very well-educated person, but still they don't know this like you do. How would you explain it to them? And that seems to work, and I think you're right on the money there. You led the reporting efforts on a lot of big issues, like fixing the American healthcare system, the battle against cancer, diabetes, and the like, and later Alzheimer's. There was the big series on Alzheimer's, the big 2-part series. Tell me about that.
Well, clearly we became aware in the 1990s that Alzheimer's was going to be a devastating illness for our growing older population. That if one lived long enough, the chances of getting some form of dementia, usually Alzheimer's, was quite high. And so we tried to start preparing the American public for this seemingly inevitable disease for so many people. And obviously, when we first started talking about it, we knew very little scientifically about it. The sad fact of the matter is today we know so much more scientifically about it, but we still don't have an effective treatment. We have some drugs that may slow down the progression in early stages, but we are still now 20 years after the intensive research effort started, very, very woeful in terms of our treatment, and so we've got a long way to go.
I'm wondering also, did your training as a pastor in seminary, do you think that had any influence on the kind of communications model or the way you talk to people?
I would think it did. I'm not the one to dissect that and be able to describe it in scientific terms, but certainly effective pastors have a way of being able to communicate with parishioners, both at the level of an audience, but more importantly on the one-to-one level, because so much of pastoral work is done on that level. So I think the combination of my experience in public speaking and my experience in private one-on-one conversation came in handy.
You never really left the ministry, from what I've read. You served as a pastor and the assistant pastor still?
Yes, I became ordained after I finished medical school and served on the staff of our congregation as we called it, an assisting pastor without any compensation, as a volunteer effort really. But because of my medical background, I was able to help parishioners with their medical issues in a way that was probably kind of unique for a pastor on the staff, and help people find the right kind of care when they would get. So that was something I continued to do even after I was full-time in medicine and media.
You've written about your spiritual journey in the book Finding God and the Questions of Personal Journey. What led you to write that? I believe you were, 65 then?
Yes. So I spent the vast majority of my working time in two very traditionally secular lines of work, the media and medicine. And everybody knew that I was an ordained minister, a believer of sorts. And so they would often ask me questions about my belief and why I believe this or how I could believe this. And so after many years of those conversations, I realized that the questions that would come up tended to be the same questions, albeit in different form, but basically the same questions. So I just decided one summer, I was thinking about that I would sit down and try to write out the answers to the questions that I was constantly being asked. And that's how the book came about. It was my attempt to, in more precise form, answer questions that I was typically and traditionally being asked about my faith journey.
How do you reconcile, or how do you come to terms with working in a very scientific medium, meaning or line of work, medicine, and something that is very difficult to explain because you can't really reach out and touch it, your faith?
You're right. The epistemology of the two professions is quite different, even though the motivation for service ideally should be very much the same. And so I've always had this instinct that reality can be approached from many different points of view using many different kinds of tools. And certainly the world of medicine rightly uses the best of our scientific tools, and the world of religion uses a different set of tools, but I think is ultimately trying to look, albeit from a very different perspective in a different way, at the same reality. One of my favorite stories is told by John Polkinghorne, who is a famous British particle physicist, but also an ordained Anglican priest, and he has written many books on the interface between science and religion. And he uses this very simple little story, but I think it illustrates the point. He said, suppose that we go into my kitchen and there's a pot of water on the stove boiling, and you ask me, why is that water boiling? And I could answer in one of two ways. I could say, well, because the heat underneath has caused the water molecules to move rapidly and come to a boil. Or I could answer your question, why is that pot of water boiling, by saying, because I want a cup of tea. Now, both answers are absolutely correct, but they answer very different questions. One is answering the question of how, and the other is answering the question why, as it were. So I think traditionally science tries to answer the how questions, and and religion, philosophy, trying to answer the why questions.
What do you hope people take away from the book?
That it's perfectly permissible to have doubt about your faith, that in fact doubt is a wonderful tool in terms of developing faith, that we're never going to have all the answers in precise scientific fashion, but we can find enough of the answers in our faith journey to help us along the way. I simply lay out how I have gone about thinking about these questions in the hopes that others might find it useful.
How have people responded to it?
Oh, I've had fascinating responses. The best part of writing the book were the hundreds of letters that I got from total strangers about what the book meant to them or what it provoked in them or inspired in them. I've saved them in a big box, and someday I'm going to reread them all. But that was the best part. Obviously, a range of response from people who felt I was right on target, and others who disagreed with what I said, and everything in between. But the spirit of the letters was wonderful.
In terms of finally stepping back from ABC and the local station, what led to your decision to retire?
Well, the local station, it was as simple as the fact that last year was my 40th year, and that just sounded like a great round number to me. I figured 40 is better than 39 or 41. Really, it was as simple and maybe as stupid as that, but it felt right, and it was right in retrospect. ABC, I still continue to do some things for them on a limited level, so I haven't completely retired. But it was, again, instinct. I wanted to quit while I was ahead, as most people do, and I had seen some sad cases of people in the media who hadn't done that, and I didn't want to be one of those. And now, 2 years later, 3 years later, I think I made the right decision at the right time.
Well, you certainly seem to be enjoying life.
Very much so. More free time. The great part about not being the full-time medical editor of ABC is I don't have to wear the beeper 24 hours a day and be on call. I miss some of the people, of course, but I was privileged to be in media when it was the golden era. Those of us who look back on it think.
Well, obviously, I'm kind of coming to the end of things, but looking back, what's given you the most personal satisfaction out of this marvelous career you've been able to enjoy?
Two things. One is I do believe that I've been able to help some people make better medical decisions for their own lives and the lives of their family. Charlie Gibson once asked me live on Good Morning America, and I don't even remember how he got into it, but it was something about the kind of work we were doing. He said, "So Tim, what do you think you accomplished with all of this?" And I said, "Well, Charlie," well, thinking, just immediate response, I have a lot of friends who think I do nothing but provide cheap entertainment for hypochondriacs. And we both laughed at that, and that's a possibility, of course. But I'd like to think it's more than that, and in fact, I think we did provide good information that helped people make decisions. The other great part of what I was privileged to do was just meeting so many interesting, thoughtful, caring, committed people, some giants in medicine that I was privileged to get to know.
As we wrap up, of course, coming back home to Illinois and being honored by the Lincoln Academy, which has honored so many sons and daughters of the state, what is your feeling about being honored by the state of Illinois?
Oh, I'm thrilled, having been born and raised here and growing up, of course, with Lincoln as one of my heroes. I think every school child in Illinois is given that opportunity, and a special blessing about coming back to the Augustana campus for this award, where I graduated in 1958 and where I have wonderful memories. I've been involved off and on with the School over the years, so it's a double blessing to be back in the state and back on the campus at Augustana.
Dr. Johnson, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
All right. Daryl, you want to check that?